Greetings and salutations. Welcome once again to the Agora. We are a forum to examine the unexamined life, or whatever the heck we decide to throw together on the drive-in. We're a place where we talk about the thing. Yes, come on. You telling me you haven't ever thrown something together on the drive-in?
No.
Oh, sorry. Richard is a great planner and has every detail of his life mapped out ahead of time.
I didn't say that either.
I am Michelle.
Hi, Michelle.
Michelle is joining us all the way from the far-off magical land of Lynn County.
Yes.
So, Michelle, welcome, by the way, this
Magical
morning. Thanks.
land.
Magical land. The grassy
Garrett likes
capital of the world.
superlatives,
It is.
if you haven't noticed.
Although it is turning into hazelnuts lately.
Ooh.
Yes.
Hazelnut's far superior to grass seed. Gotta say, grass seed makes my eyes water and makes my throat itch. Hazelnuts do not.
Cannot empathize, I'm sorry.
I love the look
I
of
have
grass.
them.
Yeah.
I definitely heard at this point in time.
We literally live in the worst allergy spot in the nation.
Yes,
And that's
we
not a hyperbole. It literally is true.
Right.
And I made the decision to move here and to stay here. Happens to be married an Oregonian.
Because of its beauty.
Because, well, my wife lived here. So
That's why he cries all the time when he's looking at it.
it's true.
And he's in nature, he's just constantly in a perpetual crying zone.
Yeah, let's go with that. Anyway, Michelle, welcome north. So just before we dive into our topic of the day, again, does the First Amendment make us more or less safe? Why don't you just share a little bit with the audience about who you are, what you do, and a little bit about what brought you here today?
Well, actually, who brought me here today was Daniel, our IT person. So he's behind the scenes.
His
but
official title is Wise Learned Producer.
I like that. That is pretty
More
cool.
superlatives.
Yes.
I think he's just the producer. And he
Okay.
sits back there behind the magical.
We also call him Oz because he's
Yes.
the man behind the screen.
And so his wife and I are actually on a team of women who work in our church. And
cool.
so we've been close friends for a while.
And what church is that, if you want to shout out?
South Albany Community Church in Albany.
Go Sac.
Yes.
Been there many a time. Wonderful, wonderful congregation.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do during the day, for those who may be wondering?
Get up very early. I actually live on a farm, and so my husband and I have a small farm in Shed, and then I go to work, and my work hours vary every single day, but it's based off of doing the job as an elected official for Lynn County.
And what is your official title?
Lynn County Treasurer and Budget Officer.
Okay, so for those in Lynn County who have not been paid yet, I take it, no, I'm just kidding.
I make sure they do get
You
paid.
make sure, okay, ideally.
Yes.
So I'm sure this whole COVID fiasco over the last several months has just been an absolute joy as far as budgets and payroll and all that
It
stuff.
is. I'm actually managing all of the infrastructure for the financial part of it
Yeah.
to get reimbursed from the state. So that is part of my job now.
Cool.
So I have been an essential office that has been going since it started.
So you're going to get some of the emergency money, right?
We
That's-
have. We got
yeah.
our first check this week, or this last week, and then now we're putting in for the second stimulus part.
Cool.
I do not envy people having to apply for that or having to sort through all the mess that is involved with it. Let's hope this is our last global pandemic for another century, because it has not been fun in the slightest. But I'm glad that there are people like
Yes.
you who are on the ground making sure that the people who need it are getting by and getting the help that they need. So thank you for doing what you do, Michelle. So
Thank you.
It's interesting that I think a lot of people don't necessarily engage a ton with local politics. There's so much discussion on the national scene and the international scene even these days, but yet I've often heard what happened. The results of your local elections actually affect your daily life a lot more, and the decisions being done at the local level. And so often they're overlooked. So we're hoping today that you can give a little bit of your perspective as we talk about this idea of free speech and functioning in a society, how we better societies. Just your experience as somebody who has to wear many different hats, as an elected official, a representative of the people, as somebody who reports to numerous different agencies and individuals, and just as a private citizen as well, as somebody who has a set of beliefs and values, and how you make those coalesce, how you can be a person of faith and with a particular worldview that guides you, but also be able to fairly represent the people of all different backgrounds and all different beliefs, and how you balance those two without coming into conflict. So I'm excited to see how this all develops. So Daniel is doing Daniel things right now. Current situation of have elected officials who seem to be encouraged one group to practice their first. while putting, not shutting down, but putting very different and higher burdens on another group. And to your point, I think that we have to recognize when we say that restrain the practice of worship in these times, it's be for all groups, Christians, Muslims. If the Satanic Temple wants to gather together and hold their ceremony, they should be allowed to.
Yeah, and prayer, whether it be at the county or city or in schools, prayer is prayer, and it means
in some capacity.
all different things to everyone. So to say that if
So
we
we're
have
back on
freedom,
there.
According, yeah.
Okay.
if we have freedom should be for everyone, and it should be
Right.
equal rights for everyone. So
Absolutely.
if I pray as a Christian and someone wants to pray as a Muslim, it should be the same value. You should have both.
Right.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think that so I kind of want to set up our conversation, since we're going to be, because the topic of the day is, does it hurt to allow people to talk? I mean, that's really what the First Amendment right is, that you have the right to say what you want to say, period. And it would be, we don't have time for a history lesson, but if you really look at I'd say from the 11th century on, you can see that there's a slow and steady progression that the only voices that get heard are the powerful. And so it's really interesting. I think Voltaire is who I would go to in my political history. Voltaire was sort of the first guy he was a French philosopher, and he said, hey, he had this incredible experience, and he was heavily moderated on what you could say, who you could criticize. And it was the Christians said, you can't say these specific things. Had this epiphany where he went and he experienced, now I'll quote him later, but he didn't actually say it. We don't know quite who said it, but he had this epiphany where he went to Great Britain, and he experienced, there were Muslims there were all different people, and they were all in the same market together, and they were getting along peaceably. And he said, I don't know what that is, but that's what I want. And later, someone who was writing to him quoted this, and I've always kept it because, to me, I think this encapsulates the idea of the First Amendment and probably the trajectory of where this is going, in that he said, I may not agree with what you say, but I will die for your right to say it. Mm-hmm. And that was a very, very radical view. I mean, it was extremely radical. It's so, we take it for granted. And the reason it was radical is because it allowed, I think, in some sense, coming out of the Enlightenment, it gave rise to the idea that the best ideas win. Not the people in power, the best ideas win.
And that more information is generally better than less
right.
information.
And so how do you topple a power system? I don't think it's by restricting free speech. Personally, I think it would be by opening it up, because it allows the best ideas. In fact, the scientific revolution is itself the ability of scientists to say, I don't care if you think you have the established, right? I can come with evidence and say you're wrong. Yeah. And I can use my free speech to, and so that dialogue and that debate, it moves societies along. Now, the flip side to that, which is I think where everyone is always terrified of, it also gives rise to people to say things that we don't like and we don't agree with. That would include a group of white supremacist groups, like real whites who, literally think they're, the Aryan
Not people
race.
who get arbitrarily called white supremacists by many mobs. Yeah.
But
the actual
But groups that we don't like, the American Nazi Party, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there are groups that have power now to speak that we don't like. And so the question, though, and I think this comes back to it, you kind of have to make a decision. If you're going to say that free speech makes the world bad, I would encourage anyone who's going to say that, go back and look at history and see what the precedent without free speech is. And that is, whoever has the stick or the power can wield it however they want. And you can't criticize them. And you know, I would argue that in some sense the French Revolution is part of that, because they didn't have any stick to wield. They didn't have any like power to criticize or to get reform. What's left? Violent revolution. And violent revolution doesn't usually work out for most people. So it's very interesting to think about like where our fears are in that, right? Because really, if you're, well, it seems kind of interesting to say that you would be against the First Amendment, because then to say anything, right? Like that, it seems like a catch-22. Like, I'm going to criticize the First Amendment
because I can without being jailed.
But I think the essence of, you know, whether you think it harms or it doesn't is where your fear is. You know, do you feel like, I personally, like for example, we had a friend who got all into the Flat Earth Society, and he's like, these people are like cuckoo. How does somebody believe this? And so he just like dove in. He wanted to know why they thought this. Where did this come from? How does somebody actually in modern day believe that the earth is flat? How do these people get there? And he was astonished just at like the bad thinking and everything. And he wanted to go in there and sort of argue with them. And one of the things is that I don't fear that, because I think the vast majority of people would be like, come on, you guys are crazy. Even if they got a small sliver of people to believe what they said. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Versus someone's fear about the First Amendment might be something like, well, they could gain a lot of power and then do a lot of harm. And that's always people's fear with it.
It's a slippery slope argument.
Right. And so you kind of have to come back to the idea of, do we believe that people can like be persuaded? Do we believe that people can be generally, you know? So anyway, that's my thought on it, kind of the big picture of where we came from and why I think it's important to encapsulate and protect free speech, even the free speech that I hate and I don't want to hear. I don't want people believing in a flat earth, and I don't want them to have a platform, so to speak, but I value the right to speak more, because I believe the best ideas will win, more than the fear of disenfranchising them. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
So just, do you get your thought again? And you have a unique perspective that we don't necessarily as a public official. So what are some of your experiences and observations in regard to that?
As I look and as I have worked through the years, I've now been with the county 25 years. This is my 25th. And my perspective on things has, I would say, from the beginning to where I am now, has changed dramatically. Working with so many different styles, different personalities, different backgrounds, realizing that everybody wants to be heard at some point, whether they're somebody like office help or whether there's somebody above you, whether it's clear up to even the governor. Everybody wants to be heard and wants someone to listen.
I think by being audibly listen to what they say, you actually consider.
Yes.
So I think that's a key difference. It's one thing to say, okay, I'll listen to your words and give them no regard, versus saying, I'm going to listen. And I may disagree, but I will give you a valid platform and legitimately, honestly consider what you have to say.
Yes. And so if my perspective on this is that if everybody comes to the table with that in mind of free speech, if you take that just for what it is, knowing that I have the ability to have free speech, I also choose, it is a choice, whether or not I listen to those around me. I can take everything that you have and what you think is your firm belief, whether you're Christian, Muslim, Baptist. I mean, you can go on through, you know, several different categories, whether or not I'm even an atheist. If my platform is what I believe and I have a strong voice in it and you let me tell you how I feel and you actually listen to it, the person who's listening then takes and analyzes the data that's given to them. If I can better myself from somebody else's platform and free speech, why wouldn't I want to do that? Exactly. And so I have always taken that into consideration. I'm actually a missionary. I have gone all over the world and probably almost about 20 countries now. Wow. And much of the last 3 years has been spent in Africa. And I have noticed in Africa, whether or not it's religion or the ability to have free speech, it's community, and it's what I would call community. And so I feel comfortable in my community, and as long as everybody values me in my community. And so in America, we have so many communities, if you look at it that way. And so everybody feels comfortable when they're in their community, but when you give free speech, you want others in another community to either agree with you or give me a reason why I don't agree with you.
So that you can know where you want to know your allies and your enemies, yeah.
And so I have watched, I don't know how many communities in Africa, and everybody has their own viewpoint about what their community is. But when they come together as a whole, I would say they do it better in being able to value what other communities do versus this is my community, this is my platform, and how dare you cross that line to come in my sphere. But let me have my own free speech so that I can give it to you what I feel you need to hear, but I'm not willing to accept what you feel is a value.
So it's almost like their community is their community because it's what they know, regardless of whether they've considered whether it's right or not. So it's like, well, this is my people, and I'm with them. That supersedes whether what they believe is ontologically, and actually correct and actually beneficial for survival.
Yes.
Because it's my community.
Yes.
He's. Oh.
Better? Okay.
So and in America we call that identity politics. That's kind of the term we have for today, is that if you are in this particular group, and we break them down often by, race, gender, ethnicity, that, this is where your loyalty needs to be, versus saying, okay, this is a part of who I am, but the group that you have put me in, I may find that what they hold, or at least certain positions they hold, are not valid.
Right.
And I'm going to speak against them, but then you're seen as, in many ways, as a traitor to your people, whatever your people might be.
Yes. And so being outside of the United States and looking back in, I have learned over the years that we've got a lot to learn from everyone.
Absolutely.
Outside of America, inside America, we all come with different things to the table. But what I can learn from you will only come about if you have the ability to have free speech and give me your opinion. I may not agree with it, but then again, it may change where I am in my sphere now because of what you've given me as information.
Yeah.
The key was it's very interesting that the big picture view of, like, I would use the word tribes.
Yes.
Like, I mean, I think it's probably right. Like tribalism. Like, this is my tribe, and you're not in my tribe, so you're the bad person. I think the interesting thing is, like, it's kind of interesting to think about what that type of thinking in general just does. Whereas if you say we're all the same tribe, or we're all neighbors, we all live in communities. And so there's a different mentality thinking, and so I wonder if so does it hurt or harm? I'm trying to stay on topic here because I know we could go. It would be my assumption that in my life, like, the more you interact with people you disagree with, the more you hear their perspective and listen.
Yes.
I think you grow as an individual, and you learn this thing called empathy.
You do.
Empathy is very powerful. Like you said, people want to be heard. Well,
Exactly.
There's this really interesting thought, which I think is one of the thoughts that free speech makes us all have to come to grips with, and that is that, kind of like Voltaire said, right? I may not agree with what you said, or not Voltaire. It's the guy. There's a friend who wrote to him. I can't remember his name right now. Forgive me for that. But there's this, like, cognitive dissonance where we have to engage in free speech, and the idea of engaging in free speech is letting others we disagree with say something that we would otherwise not agree with. And to allow someone to do that means that we're actually giving them human dignity, because we don't listen to people that we think are
That we don't agree with.
right, or they're those type of people.
Yes.
But that's a step in dehumanization.
Yes.
And so the step in dehumanization, and the sad part is that we all have those blind spots. We all have those people that we think shouldn't be heard.
Yes.
right now in our political climate, I mean, in all the movements that are going on, there are people who think those people shouldn't be heard, these people shouldn't be heard. The reality is that I think if the more you invite people to have dialogue and conversation without controlling it,
Right.
and just let people talk through things, not yell at each other, because I don't think that's constructive. But, so probably the best thing is not the two groups out on the street yelling at each other. That's usually not a good way to, but dialogue of saying, hey, what's your experience? What's my experience? Can we talk about it? Usually that'll temper people rather than make them extremists.
Well, and then it humanizes them. Again, we talk about this a lot where, like you mentioned this a lot, Richard, the idea of once you put somebody in the category of the other, you don't have to honor them or dignify them because they're this. It's like they're not entitled to.
Alfred Said, who coined the term "the other,"
Yeah.
and he used it in a reference to say, how do organizations, people dehumanize people?
Yes.
Because one of the ways you can do mass murder is you dehumanize a whole group of people.
Yeah.
Yes.
You make them less than human, and it only has to be just ever so slight. And so he coined the term "the other," and so.
Yeah, and when you put somebody in the category of the other, it's this broad kind of amorphous entity. It's not actual human beings, actual individuals, versus when you sit down and talk to somebody face to face that you might think is their beliefs are reprehensible and they're horrific, they're still a human being. When you
Yes.
look them in the eye, they have flesh and blood. They have a heart that beats just like you, and it's a lot harder to dehumanize them as individuals. But again, we're living in a society, and Daniel shared a great meme with us. You want to pull that up, Daniel, on the screen? I think this kind of hits the issue on the head of many of the challenges we're having with the idea of free speech and with the ability to actually dialogue with those we disagree with. I don't know if you can find it or not. Well, I'll just preview it for you. So in your minds, imagine this. It's the Founding Fathers adopting the Constitution, and then there's a message above it that says, now none of this applies once technology advances, basically. So it encapsulates many of the challenges we're going through these days in this. There we go. Oh, okay. So
Just to be clear, none of this counts if the nation advances technologically.
yes. So we live in a society where you can literally say, okay, I'm going to group all the people on Facebook or on whatever social media platform you have and look at what news agency they subscribe to, look at, what likes they have and put them into this category. They're not even human beings. They're just bits of information, a group on a platform. And it's easier to say, well, screw them. I don't want to listen to anything they have to say. They're not entitled to their opinion. Their opinion is nothing because they like this news agency or because they like this politician. So from your perspective, and, we're not asking you to name names or, give you dirt or anything, is this something that, in the elected sphere where the idea is that our elected officials are there to represent the interests of everybody in America who's an American citizen, regardless of personal belief, and to respect the law as opposed to respect people. And sometimes that, I think that means that you have to do things that might hurt certain people, but you have to respect the law versus, individual people. I guess, how does that play out in your experience of respecting and honoring all those in society that you've been elected to represent, even those whose views you personally might completely disagree with, or other people personally?
Sometimes I look back at this as really, if I'm going to say that I have the free will to speak and I want to be heard, what kind of a relationship do I want back from those that are going to hear it? Mm-hmm. And so for me, I value what others have to say with their free speech. Yeah. And so I want to take that into what I would consider who I am. And I don't want to shut myself off from being able to hear what the rest of the world is doing. I may not agree with everything that's going on. And technology has definitely hurt, I think, but it's also helped on the 95% and hurt on the 5%. Exactly. I think people have used Facebook, let's just talk about that for a little bit, to their advantage to hurt others. And I have seen it personally because I have had family members hurt by other people by what's been put out on Facebook. And and therefore relationships have been broken over best friends. I'm talking about grandkids and stuff. And so that saddens me to think that we've taken technology to the point of, I don't have to have a relationship with you, but let me tell you what I think of you.
Yeah.
And so I love technology on the fact that we can do so much more now with it, but there's always going to be a percentage of people that are going to use it to the bad. So,
Well, or even if it has a prevailing prevalence of removing where dialogue and conversation used to happen.
where relationships were.
Now it's just click and
Yes.
that's the end of it. Versus, and so there's no empathy. There's no back and
Right.
forth.
But there needs to be. Society still needs that piece built into it.
So would it be fair to say this? One of the keys is, so we have a right to say what we want.
Yes.
Okay, so we can do that, but we can do damage with what we say.
We definitely
okay.
can.
So there's a difference between your freedom to speak and wisdom of what to say, when to
Yes.
say it, how to say it.
Particularly in areas where you
And-
may not be the most
And
knowledgeable.
I think
and
one
say,
of the
maybe I
one of the
shouldn't speak on
keys
this.
is when you're face to face with someone, you're considering. Like we had David Manick on, and one of the things he showed, he said, you're wired for a 3-dimensional interaction. And so to prove it to me before we were on air, he just looked at me and he just came at me, and I reacted, and he said, see, it's automatic. You can't take it away. And so when you're face to face with somebody, you're sensitive to how they would respond in a way that is different than online, where you might just be like, well, I have the right to say this, bam!
Yep.
Versus, well, I care about you, like, I'm so, or your feelings were hurt by it, I'm so sorry. Like, so there's a difference between
I agree
freedom
with
of
that.
speech
Yes.
and wisdom in
Yes.
knowing. And so the key would be hopefully to say, we want to meld those two together,
Yes, we
or the
do.
best possible world of
Exactly.
freedom of speech is
So
melding
how do you
those.
take
Well,
that to the younger
And
generation?
then also, you're free to say whatever you want. You're not free from the consequences of whatever you say as well.
Yeah,
Okay, wait,
well,
say that one more time.
I said you're free to say whatever you want, but you're not free from the consequences of what your speech brings about.
Well, and that's the issue. The consequences, when we talk about consequences, the idea of the First Amendment is that the government, the state, who is there to represent all people, regardless of belief, shall not create laws that restrict or restrain one particular group over another to show particular animus.
Right.
It doesn't mean that from the private sector, if there is a company.
It certainly does that.
Oh, the media, absolutely. Like, they're a company, and I'm not one of these big, again, I think cancel culture is ridiculous, but I will say there are certain organizations that, knowing causes they contribute to and things they stand for, I just say I choose not to buy their product.
Yes.
I won't say which. I don't go out and demand that they be canceled. I don't ask that the government shut them down. But and if people ask, I'll say this is why, and okay, if you're going to buy this product, if you're going to support this organization, keep in mind these are some of the things they do with their money.
I think one of the things
as a private citizen.
It's interesting because I think one of the things that social media has brought out is that, like 100 years ago, you probably bought things from people that you would diametrically disagree with
Because you didn't know better.
because you didn't know better.
You didn't have
And
information.
I
I don't know what
actually
Henry Ford is
wonder.
donating is.
Yeah. I actually
million
wonder
dollars,
though
yeah.
if like it doesn't. If the idea is we're only ever going to do business with people we agree with.
Yeah.
How do you have a globalized world economy?
Well, and I think,
I mean, like
yeah.
fundamentally, like you need to unpack
Absolutely.
that. How do you? What about like what if you decide that certain people groups you don't like, that may really harm them, even though you don't agree with them? I think the key is getting past a certain point where we say like, okay, are we okay? And I think this is an American value. Some people might say they're not okay with, but are we okay with the idea that I can interact with somebody and I can have good for them because they are giving them dignity, even if I disagree with them?
Well, and that gets the idea. Some people.
And that's a deeper question, because
Yeah.
if your one goal is I'm going to go out and hurt everybody and take everything away from everybody that I don't agree with,
And I have the right to do that.
that's a different kind of thinking than I value people who I may not agree with. And by value, I mean I literally want them to have
Yeah.
goodness in their life. Like, I don't think they should be disenfranchised, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, we're living in a culture where a lot of people view giving somebody a platform as agreeing with them and condoning them. I believe I can. Hello, hello. So there is this idea that, okay, I'm going to allow somebody to speak, and somebody takes that and says, you agree with everything this person says or everything they believe. And it's like, no, I'm just allowing them to speak. It's not enough to not agree with them. You can't even give them a platform, because they say, well, by giving them a platform, by not shutting them down, by not actively speaking against them, you are agreeing with them. The old silence is violence has become one of the catchphrases these days. If you don't directly speak out against something, you're essentially condoning and agreeing with that idea or that person. And it's like, no, I'm simply allowing them to speak. I didn't say whether I agree or disagree with them or not. So it's the idea that you can't even give somebody a platform, because even to give them a platform to speak and say, hey, they're going to share information. Why don't you come and listen, and as a rational thinking human being, decide whether you agree with them or not. Decide what they're saying is valid based on information.
All of that's going to depend on what you fear.
Exactly.
It really is going to be defined by what you fear.
Yeah.
If you hate free speech, it's because you think the people that you fear are going to use it to hurt you.
So Michelle, is this something that you've experienced where people are hesitant to even give people a platform, or give groups, give certain positions,
Yes.
for fear of being seen as condoning that?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
It's hard in the political forum to keep everything uniform.
Yes.
And so you'll have those that scream louder, and those are usually the ones that get heard. And then you have
often the majority.
It's definitely never the majority. It's
Yeah.
always just usually a very small group that scream the loudest, that then you've got to figure out, what do we do with them?
Yeah.
And that's really, and I would say that even for most governments, it's kind of like, okay, now we have this sitting in front of us. What do we do with this? How do we make it to where it's fair for them, but fair for everybody who's not screaming or crying out?
Exactly.
It's a hard position to be in when you're a politician, to understand that just because they scream loudest does not mean that it's the view of everyone.
Yeah.
And how do you balance that? It's really hard in politics to do that.
Well, and I think the danger comes where public intimidation forces those in power, again, who are called to enforce the law fairly, to uphold the laws of the land. It forces them to bow to the will of the mob mentality. And not to get overly political here, one thing I've noticed.
You say that, then I
Okay.
think you're gonna
I'm
get
sorry.
overly
Well, okay,
political.
so
like, don't qualify your statement. If you're getting overly political, by the way, all views expressed are those of individuals only, and not of this whole
I will
podcast.
use a contemporary example that I'm not trying to take a position on this one way or another, but the racial unrest across this country for the last several months has been very palpable, and I don't envy any prosecutor or any DA who's ever in a position going forward of having to decide whether or not to prosecute police officers in a criminal setting. Because while we all want justice to be served fairly, and we recognize that nobody is above the law, no police officer is above the law, I do picture, say I'm a district attorney in a town where there's been a police-involved shooting of controversy, and the public is angry. One side is particularly angry and is voicing their frustration. And you look at the evidence of the case and you say, as the law states, from the perspective of what the law has said, this was a justified shooting. This is a justified use of force.
Yes.
But looking at past precedent, looking at what has happened, saying, if I don't charge, I risk an angry mob burning my city down.
Yes.
And to think that has no influence over what that district attorney or what those prosecutors or what those elected officials are thinking, I don't know how you can separate that. And that's the danger of, and you can use examples on all sides. The idea is if you just whip up an angry mob, you can actually force elected officials who are supposed to be impartial to bend to your will. And that's the scary thing on all sides, right, left, wherever. What if it's something that you just whip up enough angry people who are going to cause enough mayhem that you can bend them to your will.
The use of selective force is I think the interesting thing is a couple of things to just kind of think through. Number one is, do we want a society where force is the greatest denominator? Nietzsche said that there is no truth, all that's left is power.
Exactly.
Foucault and many other philosophers picked up on this, that there's only power structures, and deconstructionists have run with this all the way through, where they say the reason this system has to come down is because it's infiltrated with the wrong kind of thinking, and it's a power structure, and you beat it down. I think the problem with that is you're always going to just build another one that has other unjust.
Yes, every one of them is going to have something within it.
Also,
Right,
the
right.
problem is
Yes.
But
humans.
it is.
Yeah.
But the foundational thing though is if violence becomes the tool and weapon to get what you want, that's not a society I want to live in.
Me either.
I would much rather have someone yell and scream and call me all sorts of bad names than them to be able to physically come and hurt my family, which has super long lasting.
So
damaging
to
effects.
counter that idea, though, what if you've been saying something for a long time and the power structures in place have been put there from your perspective to keep
Right.
you from being able to do anything? So you've been promised this idea that you have representation, but you've not actually seen results from your representation. So then what do you do when you?
It's a fair point.
Yeah.
You speak out against
Isn't
these
that the
things and nothing
frustration though of
changes.
all of life? Like you don't always get your way. Like there are things that people every day would wish could happen and don't happen. Unfortunately, the benefit of all is to not go into a society where power or violence is the common denominator. More people will get hurt if you go that direction than not. And are you going to, so this is the question I would pose back. I totally hear what you said, and I think it's a fair comment. And there's probably a lot of people who are frustrated. And honestly, we need people who are frustrated to come together with those to listen, to have dialogue, not more Facebook yelling and screaming, but actual real like community level dialogue of, hey guys, like this is how we feel, this is how we don't feel heard. And if you look into the psychology, having gone through great traumas in my life, one of the key things that was helpful in healing me was being heard. So I think there's value in that, and we need to move in that direction. But
at
if
the same time,
if
not giving someone a platform for destruction.
if you do, the question I would pose back is: are you really getting justice? Like, is the destruction of
revenge?
all of people who have nothing to do with it going to lead
Extremes.
like is it's going to hurt more people?
It is.
Every time there's a huge revolution, it hurts. So
You're paying evil with evil.
I would.
At that point.
It is. I
Why
don't
can't
want to
we
get
have a
into
revolution
specific
like the
details, but
Enlightenment again?
major
I mean, why can't we
violent
do
political
that?
revolutions always hurt the poorest of the poor.
Yes.
Always.
Exactly.
Always. Always. So if you care about those people, you need to keep a system intact
Yes.
that preserves those people and holds them up and doesn't allow them to get hurt because they're the ones with the least power.
Yes.
So there is, and that doesn't mean that you can't have change, and change is slow. I think it's Barack Obama who said it himself very clearly. He said, it is, democracy is painful because you go 2 steps forward, 1
And
back,
back.
and then and it's painful and it's slow.
Well, that's why
But
they,
it's a slow, the idea hopefully is a slow and steady progress forward.
Right.
That we are creating the more unjust society. It's going to take a long time.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating for people who want it overnight. But in general, actually I shouldn't say in general, in almost every single case that I've ever looked at, I have not seen a case where you get really good results with huge violent revolutions.
And even from the political realm, in putting politicians all in the same room and saying, okay, we got to figure this out, how to make it better, and then coming up with more laws that try to govern those who are governing the people. And I don't think that's always good.
Right.
Because I know right now they're in legislation to try and figure out how do we come up with new laws that are going to tell these people what to do. And I really think that they're doing it too fast. When you do it too fast, the reaction is going to be
Yeah.
you're not going to get something good. So you really need to bring to the table
Yeah.
all those that need to be involved and need to be heard in order for a law to be written even.
Right.
Well, there's an old saying that says never make an important decision when you're upset.
Right.
And I think you see a lot of that again with the current political climate of there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of anger on all sides. So is this the best time to make sweeping, massive, altering changes in our legislation and our society? Or is it,
Or cutting budgets completely down to the nothing.
again,
so
to
that they can't.
pacify?
Yes.
It's like, let's have that honest conversation. If you look
Daniel,
at it and you say,
you wanted to say something?
We can't forget the context in which there's been the pandemic, and we've had these sweeping, extreme,
Everything's
very
extreme
fast,
right now, off the charts.
legislation going on.
well, it's not even legislation, it's executive, and that gets into a whole other legal
Yeah, I guess
realm.
Yeah.
it's not even legislation. It's executive orders.
It's
and
it's one executive saying you're going to do this or else.
Yeah, exactly.
And
So-
that's a whole nother.
And
avenue.
where's our rights with freedom of speech in the midst of all of the laws that are being written as we speak, as fast as we can speak?
Yeah, it's one of those, how do I say this? My hope, my bias, if you want to call it, is that I have a great, and maybe I am naive, but
we know you are. But.
no, I believe that if you got enough people in a room who were ready and willing to listen, they're not in fight or flight, they're not ready to scream at people, but just ready to start the process of I'm going to listen. And we live in a very, like, the polarization in our society is worse than it was 20 years ago.
Oh, amen.
And whatever we can do to deconstruct that, I would say is of great value to everyone. I think it's of great value to everyone to come together and have meaningful dialogue. Now, dialogue is not, I'm right, you're wrong, and that's the end of it. Dialogue is, here is the way that I see the world, and they get heard, and then somebody else says, here's the way that I see the world. And there's this kind of iron sharpen iron effect that tends to happen, and good dialogue tends to move people away from the extremes.
Well,
And-
and I think the problem is, and I agree with you 100%, the problem is when some people say, well, we want to be heard, what they mean by that, not everybody, but a lot of them is, we're going to tell you the way it is, and you're going to listen and agree with everything we have to say. You know, it's versus saying, hey, we want a seat at the table. We want a seat that is equal to your seat, that is equal to your seat. What a lot of people mean, or what it ends up as saying, we want the entire table to do whatever we want and bash you over the head with it. Yeah. And I think that's the problem, is you see that extreme come out where it's not that I want an equal voice, it's I want my voice to be heard above all
you know
the
what?
voices.
But I think all people, so if you're listening and you're on the left, there's a particular set of subgroup of people that you're gonna wish didn't have any freedom of speech to tell you. Okay? If you're on the right, you're going to see that there's a particular subset of group of people that you wish didn't have a right. It goes both ways, which is why I'm saying the more you give in to the idea of not being willing to converse. And so this would go both ways. You have to come to the realization that if you have those meaningful conversations, you could get people closer together, not farther apart. Yeah. If your goal is, I'm just going to keep going further apart, and those people are all the problem, and they're all the bad people, if you have that mindset, then you're just pushing people into their corner more and more and more and more. And the more you polarize, the less likely you are to be neighborly. Like, for example, think about, I'll give you a thought experiment. Imagine walking through your neighborhood and just kind of like what we do on Facebook, we mark what each one of my neighbors is. And now I'm going to choose to whether I be friendly to them, or I'm rude to them, or I don't talk to them.
Or you look at the sign in their front
Are
yard
you
for
looking,
candidate.
are you looking for those things? And now you're going to, well, then I argue you're part of the problem. That's not tolerance. The unfortunate and incredible idea of the American experiment is that even the value of being neighborly is, these are my neighbors. I may not agree with them with everything. How do I want to treat them? And how do I want them to treat me? If I have an issue, I hope they'd come over and help me. Regardless of my race, of my sexuality, of my... And the interesting thing, the thought experiment, is two people who could be diametrically opposed, politically, religiously, all the things, right? Could be neighbors, and they could be friendly to each other. And if that's the kind of society we want, then you give the rights to people to disagree with you, and yet you treat them the same. And that is with respect and dignity, and you can't necessarily make them agree with you, but you say, you know what, even if they don't agree with me, I'm going to treat them as a neighbor. And to put it in that context really frames it differently, because then you're not just saying, oh, well, that person's the bad. It's like, well, that's a human being. They have a family. They have emotions. They have thoughts, feelings, and it moves away from dehumanization. And the more you give in to extremism, the more you dehumanize the people you disagree with.
So here's one thought on that. The only thing that you can change is yourself.
There you go.
You can't change your neighbor, and you can't make them like you, but you have a choice as to whether or not you go in with, I'm going to like you no matter what.
Yeah. Well, and again, that gets back to the idea of to like them, to show them dignity, doesn't mean I condone or agree with everything they believe. But there is that idea of, if I even associate with them, what if somebody sees me associating with them and they're going to think, oh, what are they doing with that wicked person, or that person who has this political bumper sticker on their car, versus saying, hey, they're a human being. They are entitled to certain dignity. They are my neighbor. To bring it into a biblical perspective, that as everybody is your neighbor, regardless, again, of race, gender, ethnicity, all that, they are entitled to certain human dignity and certain respect and honor. There's a different relationship there versus, what I would say is my brother, which is a covenant relationship. And like, I have obligations towards my wife that I don't have towards my neighbors living across the street, but I still have obligations. The levels, depending on the level of relationship, it's certainly, there's greater obligations, there's greater cohesion we must have within certain relationships. But simply by virtue of being human, we have a commonality and we have obligations towards other humans.
That's a really interesting connection I just made when you talked about relationship, and Richard was talking about association. What if I don't know, maybe there's like a whole chain reaction where social media has dehumanized everybody to the point where we have equated association with relationship. And so thereby any type of association is then translated into a relationship that you have.
So you were like in a room with a really bad person,
and you're associated.
And you had no idea, but you're associated.
And now you are in a relationship with them. That means you condone what they do. If you've purchased anything, you've given to support their lifestyle, you agree with everything about them or anything. So in order to not be seen as in a relationship or condoning or a part of, we have to just disassociate from absolutely anything that we don't want to be a part of.
Which means we all just go back into our communities. And
we just become our little tribes.
Actually, you would go to your deserted island, because even within your community, there's going to be people that you
and then eventually your community finds something else to divide over. There is an endless subset of things to which we could divide over.
There's a beautiful illustration I heard about this from Ravi Zacharias. It was a story he told where a guy gets stranded on a desert island. He's there for like 5 years and finally is rescued. And when they come and rescue him, there are 3 buildings that he's built on this tiny little island. They asked what the first building was. He says, oh, that was my home. And then the second building, he said, oh, that's my church. And they said, well, what's the third building? He's like, oh, that's where I used to go to church before I got a falling out. So you're right that even with the idea that you'll find something to divide yourself over if you look deep enough, regardless of the level of commitment or relationship you have with somebody. So we have about 15 minutes left here, so let's kind of dive just back into this idea of, is free speech, does it do more harm or good?
Well, something I just want to comment on that I think is really fundamentally important, and probably all the people that need to hear this dialogue aren't going to hear it. That's always how it goes. But
I turn it off.
But one of the things like I really avoid, I do not post things on Facebook. No. I do not, and the reason for that is because I value friendships that I have.
Do you feel like you have free speech on Facebook?
Do I feel like? Sure, I think I could. I mean, but I also think that.
But you don't post things, so you seem like you're not free.
I think that social media should have the same. Should have that the rights of free speech should extend into social media.
I don't think everyone thinks that, though.
Yeah, I know that not everyone thinks that, but I'm a free speech.
I mean, so we don't have anything online to protect those rights like we do in
I know that's why
interesting. Because tech companies who
there's
an
FCC regulation that gives them
a publisher.
Yeah.
Well, if they act as a publisher, then they're responsible for what you say.
They're not bound by the FCC regulations, federal communication.
But if they're not a publisher, then they're not responsible for what you say.
Correct.
So there's some that act like publishers, and there's some that don't. And
it's a loophole. Anyway, it will have to be dealt with. There'll be one of two things. There will either be hate speech laws that ban everyone from saying anything that the establishment has said you can say, or there'll be a law that says everybody has the right to say whatever they want. The interesting thing, though, you said earlier, the only thing we can control is ourselves. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is, do we take into consideration how someone else is going to see our post? And what I mean by that is, so if I was to go post things, I would be thinking about, man, I might hurt someone's feelings by posting this, or it's not going to be received in the way I want it to be received, or because you can't encapsulate ideas in like a simple, I mean, you can make points, but I value someone who, I want somebody to know that I value their relationship more than I value their opinion. And that to me is a fundamentally different way of thinking. And I think that goes into the wisdom thing of like, what can you control? Only yourself. And I want people to know that I value them as a person, not just as, oh, you agree with me or disagree with me. I think that's I would argue that's a really shallow way of looking at the world.
So if we take it back years and years about free speech and what they did years ago versus the way we envision free speech now, I think we've taken it radically to the other side, thinking that my right to free speech is I can do damage. I don't think years and years ago that they considered free speech damaging. It was just, no, you have a right at the table.
Well, it was a different type, so it's ironic that when you look at from a political spectrum, the vast majority of free speech suppression throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s was often from the right in the form of censorship.
Yes.
We can't have these bad words being
Communists.
said. What'd you say?
The McCarthyism is what they called it.
Exactly.
McCarthyism, like if you're a communist, you're a bad person.
There's that, and then that morphed in from the kind of the grassroots effort of censorship of music, movies, the moral majority of the 1980s. And now you look at it's kind of flipped the other way, where the vast majority is, from the left of any voice that could be seen as, defined as hate speech, defined as hateful, defined as divisive, non-inclusive. We need to shut those voices down. And that's not
yes
every
and
single
no.
person.
There are people who want to ban burning the flag, from the right.
I'm not saying it's exclusive. I'm just saying that I think that shifted more from one.
I think
the pervasive media is left-leaning, and I think that's we see it all the time.
Which flies in the face of classic liberalism, which is much more like modern-day libertarianism, where it's saying, hey, if what you do that personally doesn't affect me, go for it, do it. As long as I don't have to supplement it, or you're not asking me to change or conform to what you believe.
But if you try, then I'm going to battle you.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't want to smell your marijuana. I don't care if you use it, but
just use it away from my house.
Exactly.
But it's so interesting because we spent so much money trying to fight that for so long, and now that's a whole other discussion. But I think it really comes down to whether or not a lot of whether you support free speech. I mean, I think it's kind of an oxymoron if you don't support free speech, but you're going to use speech to explain. You got to use free speech. There's some things of just because you can say what you want to say doesn't mean that it's helpful or important. Number two is there's a wisdom aspect, which is what I'm going to say wise. Is it helpful? Is it and lastly, like the importance of looking at other humans as people to be heard.
Yes.
And so with respect. And that I would say when that's not the case is if you're screaming and yelling at them, if you're using a threat of violence against them. I don't think I think the key is sitting down, having dialogue, helping people. And the reason I value that is because I think it gets rid of extremism. And I think it helps meter out and would help communities come together. And isn't that the goal? I mean, that's what I hope the goal is people can come together. Neighbors can be neighbors. Neighbors can help each other out. Whether or not they agree, they can be neighbors. They can be good people towards one another. That's the community I want to live in. I don't know if that's the community we have, but that's the community I want to live in.
Well, and I think through the generations, it's up to parents in order to teach their children that portion of it. I think we've gotten away from that. Because so many people in the schools, you see that the parents are relying on the schools to be the parent. And so that's where I think in this last 20 years, we have shifted so much of our responsibility as a parent give it to somebody else.
Exactly.
I don't
Let
want to
them
do
handle
it. And so therefore, this is the repercussion of us not teaching our children respect at an early age.
Right.
Goes through time.
Well, and along
We've
those
lost
lines,
it.
yeah, absolutely. And
Well, then they're going to
along
have
those-
all the people say America was founded on the Tea Party. I mean, not Tea Party. What is it called?
Boston
The
Tea
Boston.
Party, yeah.
The Boston Tea Party of throwing all the.
It's not
and
the
so,
same equivalent to
So
burning down
there's
those
some
guys,
room
but-
in there of saying there's some.
Exactly.
You can have some.
Well, I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
Along those lines, my duty as a parent, I have a 6 and a 3-year-old. Richard has 5 kids of his own, and so we relate to this idea as we're helping to formulate their worldview in their formative years. Right now, they say that what a child learns before like 6, is the most influential years in their development, and we try to instill this idea in our sons of, we don't want you to be afraid of hearing different information. Right. We don't want you to be afraid and stick your fingers in the ear and say, la, 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 la. And I think that, I'll as a Christ follower, I'll admit that sometimes Christians can screw up in this area where you say, la, 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 the Bible says, I don't want to hear anything else, versus saying, okay, I'm actually going to listen to this opposing viewpoint.
Or everyone who's outside of the walls of the building is your enemy.
Exactly,
Which is not.
the other tribe. Well, so Ricky Gervais, I don't know if you guys know who he is. He's a British actor, yeah. Very, very far left, but also not. He doesn't pull any punches. Like, he calls out everybody and everyone. So he's kind of hated on all sides of the political spectrum in Hollywood. But he's a devout atheist, but. He doesn't go. For one thing, he doesn't actively try to suppress people of religion. He doesn't call for its suppression. He's saying, "Hey, I believe this. You believe that. That's fine." But he talked about how one of the things that led him toward atheism was when he was young, he would ask his mother questions about the Bible that he had a hard time answering, and his mother basically said, "Well, just don't question that. Just don't worry. Just have faith and trust." And
it's helpful.
And he said that led him to believe, well, if she doesn't have the answer and just says, well, just believe it and take it on faith, or he would say, well, what about this? And she would say, well, don't read that. Don't expose yourself to that. And that's kind of what led him to start to question. Exactly. Just shut up and believe, versus saying, okay, I'm going to expose myself. I'm going to consider the possibility that my worldview could be wrong, and let the evidence and let reason and rationale decide.
But what's interesting though is that I think our universities have embraced that. That they don't want students to be exposed to ideas that might upset them. And the interesting, if the best idea wins, then I don't know if I'm not super, like I said, I'm not afraid of flat earthers because I don't think they're going to get anywhere. But I think that's always the case is,
Definitely not going to get anywhere to like Mars.
I know.
Don't walk to
Maybe
the edge of the
maybe
earth
their
and
plan
fall
to
off.
get there is to walk off the edge and fall to Mars.
Fall
Who knows?
down.
I don't know.
Okay, so like if you built a rocket based on like flat, I would like to see that. Like an Elon Musk who believes in the flat Earth, they do all their calculations based on it being flat and see what happens.
Wait, Elon Musk believes the Earth's flat?
No.
No.
If
I was
you-
going
I
to say,
know
I
you
was like,
had
no,
an
he
Elon Musk.
No, a
he
billionaire.
does not. Okay.
He's building his own rocket.
We're going to get a call from Elon Musk's
No,
lawyers
that is-
any moment now.
No. Somebody who.
I think
libel.
Elon believes in free speech. I think we're okay.
No, I think Elon's cool.
So, yeah,
I just want to see a rocket based on flat Earth mechanics.
Right.
And see what happens.
It's one of
Small
those
cartoon
things
show.
that, like, are we going to produce a culture, is the goal to produce a culture that has the tenacity to allow the best ideas to win? Because I think that moves progress forward.
Yeah.
If you don't think that, then I think, I don't know how, looking at the history of science, looking at the history of debate and everything else like that, generally speaking, hopefully the best ideas win. However, that also means that people who you disagree with have to have a platform to say things that you don't like.
Well, and that's the ultimately question is, are we going to respect, again, does the First Amendment, do we want it to apply for everybody no matter what? And do we want to allow even the bad ideas to be exposed and to come into the light? So one of the, if you want a great example of this principle at work, Google the Skokie, Illinois March case in 1973. And very brief background, the American Nazi Party was holding rallies in and around the city of Chicago and different city parks, and the city basically started putting roadblocks in their way. They weren't actively saying you can't speak, you can't do this, but they were saying like, oh, you can do this, but you had to fill out these 1,000 forms in triplicate, or you can do this, but you can't display the swastika. And basically, they made it. They didn't actually say you can't, but they put so many loopholes, or I mean, so many roadblocks in their way that they were effectively blocking their right to free speech. So they wanted to have a march through Skokie, Illinois, which had the largest concentration of Holocaust survivors in America. Many of them who were, just a couple decades removed from the Holocaust, and the city was denying their right. So they reached out to the ACLU, and they sent a Jewish lawyer to David Goldberger to defend the American Nazi Party. And his point was, he said, look, and he got death threats. He's like, my own people hate me, those on the right, those on the left, everybody hates me now. But he said,
the constitutional right.
Exactly. And he said, of course I disagree with what they're saying. Of course it's reprehensible, but they have a legal right to do it, and the First Amendment has to work for everybody, and their constitutional rights are absolutely being violated. And I think that's just a great example of saying, are we going to respect the rights for everybody, regardless of whether we agree with them or not?
Because here's one thing too, is that if you allow somebody a platform to give their feelings and what they feel are their rights, and you give yours, that doesn't mean that they won't meet you halfway and have an understanding of where you're coming from either.
Exactly.
So you've got to allow them the same ability to take and grasp how your feelings are and what you feel very strongly about. But there's got to be a point of, you've got to agree that you both have a right to say it, because you don't know that they're going to eventually, who knows, they might agree with you.
The egocentrism
Yes.
of this, which is very egocentrism. Look that up. It's a great
Good
word.
Scrabble
Basically
word,
means
too.
you're really selfish and you tend to bias your own thoughts to
Yes.
think about how important your thoughts are compared to others. I
I have
Because they're
relatives that are that
me.
way.
yeah, egocentric.
Yes.
We're all guilty of it, including me.
Yep.
The interesting thing is that it's a very egocentric viewpoint to be like, no one else should be heard.
Right.
And I would argue it's narrow-minded.
Mm-hmm.
It's not open for dialogue, not open to reason. An egocentric viewpoint is, like, my idea is the best, and why would I ever need to hear from anyone else who might disagree with me?
Well,
Where
inside-
you might actually learn something, you might. And the other thing maybe to think about is, it is always the possibility. There's always the case. Like, I always say this. I am open to looking at the world differently. If new evidence approaches and I say, yeah, that makes more sense. And
If
I
you
was
walk
wrong
to the
about
edge of the
this.
earth and you
Yes.
look down,
I was
and you
wrong
see,
about this issue. Yeah, I haven't walked the whole earth yet, but I have flown in planes. I'm pretty sure it's round.
that's just a mound. Then you go down and it flattens out.
I've seen mounds. Mount Hood's a mound. But that your view of the world could be incomplete.
Yeah.
And that to make a better, more whole picture of the world, you might need someone else's viewpoint to round it out. And that is a constructive, I think, good thing to help everyone do that. And the university, I think, was founded on that principle. I'm not sure they're still there. Yeah. At least not all of them.
Well, how do you gain wisdom and knowledge if you don't listen to others?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You will never become a wise person if you only have one viewpoint.
Yeah.
And I'm all about gaining knowledge and gaining wisdom.
Right.
Each and every day, I think there's always something to be learned.
Right.
And if you keep yourself saying, I will only view
Read
my
lots of
opinion,
books.
yes,
Yep.
then you are never going to go anywhere.
And in some cases, that knowledge may be, yeah, this group is really as stupid as I thought they were.
It
Let's
could
let the
be.
American Nazi Party speak at our university and actually go, and so we can actually give them enough rope to hang themselves with, so to say, and say, yep, they're just as dumb, their viewpoints are just as ridiculous, and not guarded any facts we thought, versus, never allow. It's the old adage of, you say something's taboo forever and people want it even more.
Yes.
And it is absolutely true. It's like telling my 6-year-old, don't go into, whatever you do, don't go into the forbidden closet of mystery. You will hate it. And don't ever, of course. So it's like, okay, this is why you shouldn't go in, for a 6-year-old. But
Study done a little while ago that actually showed that, like, people who had access to certain YouTube videos actually moved away from, like, white supremacy and extremism
Yeah.
and stuff like that when they were allowed to hear viewpoints from other views and stuff like that. So I think there's I think we're kind of all on the same page. I was really hoping we got to get someone in here who
You want
hates.
somebody who hates?
Yeah, we got to
you know,
get someone
goes
in here who
the other
hates
way,
free
has a
speech.
viewpoint
And
on
then we're
it.
going to let them use free speech to tell us how much
Well,
they hate
I would
free
say
speech.
that years ago, I probably would have been that way because I was, as a young child, it's kind of like my way is what I.
The way.
Yeah, the way.
Yeah.
But I think the older that you get, you gain more wisdom and knowledge, and you realize that having an opinion is one thing, but listening to others makes your opinion change. And so that's where you need to be.
I would say we need to wrap up here in a couple minutes, but on that line, I would just ask, my final thought, or I want to get from you, Michelle, is just how has your time in public service helped to maybe fashion or alter the way in which you view the value of free speech and free dialogue and this idea of representing the viewpoints and the beliefs of everybody, regardless of your personal viewpoint, your personal agreement with it?
Well, I can say if you ever have to go to legislation, and even if you know people that are on the panel and you have to speak before them, it's a scary thing to have to do. But you realize that if you're there for the voice of the people and you're trying to change legislation, and you may not agree with everybody else in the room because there's always one side that's against what they're trying to pass and one side that's for it, and knowing that you're trying to take everybody's viewpoints in before a panel of people saying, well, here's what I feel, but here's the information I'm bringing to the table based upon a larger group. And so we always do these very large groups, come to a subgroup, and then the presentation is by one or two, but it's from a very large point of view. And so I've learned in politics that the more people that you can get involved from the beginning of it, the easier it is to present for legislation to go forward with. And so I've learned that through the years. It's not about your opinion, it's actually about everybody having a voice. And so I would say from 25 years ago to now, I have learned that it really does matter to listen to everybody, and it's not that you're going to agree, because I can honestly tell you in legislation, you will never agree with everybody in the room. But when you can get a consensus from everybody about the direction that we need to go, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I think the kind of the end point of the whole discussion really comes down to you either have to allow good ideas to go forward, and I mean, if you really believe your idea is good, then you can move it forward.
Justify it.
Yeah, and I think that's the hard part that people don't like. But I also think that there's a certain sense in which the common just ability, like for example, I have been, with everything going on, I've been watching really old videos, and what used to happen on TV in the 50s and 60s is they would nationally publicize debates
Yes.
between different groups, really extremist groups. And what they would do though is they would get, everyone was dialoguing. And now what happens is everyone goes to their group of people and they only hear that voice.
Right.
And then they think everyone else is an idiot.
Right.
And I don't care where you are in the political spectrum, that's probably how you
Absolutely.
view the world.
Oh, yeah.
Versus the idea of like, you know what, we need to hear things from different people so we can synthesize. And so here's the deal. There's the thesis, there's the antithesis, and there's the synthesis. And this is how ideas usually get moved forward. You get the thesis, you get the antithesis. Most people synthesize, and they say, oh, those are the best ideas from this, and that's the best ideas from this. I think that's partly how our Constitution, which is
Was
like,
intended.
well, it literally was the antithesis to,
Absolute monarchy.
absolute monarchical power and
King says it,
dictatorship.
so do
It
it.
was,
Do it.
Yeah.
it was,
I am the king.
but it was also the reverse of how do you stop mob rule.
Yeah.
So what's the synthesis? Representative republic.
And that everybody,
synthesis.
even if 99.9% of the population agrees on one thing, that 0.1%, if it is a right, you cannot take that right away.
Right.
So even if 99.9% of the population believes a group doesn't have the right to speak, the First Amendment doesn't care about the numbers, doesn't care about the percentages. A wise producer, do you have any final thoughts as we wrap things up here? Brilliant observation.
Here we go. No, I got it. So, no, I wanted to really talk about the cliche about if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wouldn't that be nice?
Totally
That's
forgot,
really
yeah.
wisdom, though. I don't know if that's freedom of speech, but yeah, that's wisdom.
Tell you, we'll dive into that
I
next
wonder
week, I
today
promise.
if it's. I feel like maybe it's the opposite today, where people are like, you should say the things. that are
aren't
not nice.
I mean, is it outdated?
I don't know.
Should we still
I
live by
think-
that?
The truth is.
I think about how someone else feels.
How do we define
I think
nice?
about how someone else feels, and so I'll try not to say those things.
Maybe a more relevant thing is, do you sacrifice truth for kindness? Or vice versa?
I think, yeah. I mean, this is a whole can of worms we could dive into. Good thing we got to
I
show
mean,
them.
what
And
is-
then when you add
what
politics
is
on top
true?
of that, then it really shift
Synthesis
changes everything.
Of
Yeah.
this whole conundrum is, when somebody close to you asks, "How do I look in this clothing?"
there-
and how
there's-
do you respond?
there's- yeah.
Probably your
There's the
viewpoint.
truth and the
There's so much
truth.
to unpack there because you could say, we live in a postmodern deconstructionist worldview. That's the predominant view of the world, meaning that everything you like. Is
All
there
right, all right,
something?
We're heading down another rabbit
Rabbit
trail.
trail?
I
That,
know.
you know what? We
Squirrel.
need to.
I call it a
We need to. That needs to be a question that we delve into.
I agree. If only we had another
Derrida,
show in
Foucault,
1 week's time that we could talk
Nietzsche.
about.
Although some people have said Nietzsche wasn't a postmodernist, but I don't think that's true. I think he was.
Well, he did have a sweet mustache, that's all I care
Perspectivalism,
about.
that was his thing. Just a bazillion eyes looking in every direction, everyone having a different perspective, but no one's ultimately right.
On that note, it's been a joy having you here, Michelle. Thank you so much. Any final words or any shout outs you want to give to anybody who may be listening?
Yeah, this has been interesting. This was a first for me.
Cool.
Well, hopefully it's not
Yeah.
a last, because
I did. This was good.
there's so many more things we talk about. If you have anybody else in the
I got a
Lynn
whole
County
list. I got a
elected
whole
series-
list
Yeah,
for
we'd,
ya.
we'd love to, even if the conversation is just really practical too, of somebody who says, here's the way we go about and make decisions, and here's the tension and what happens.
And I will say, Lynn County is kind of unique. If you look at all of Oregon, Lynn County will vote one way, and the rest of Oregon will vote the opposite.
They're free thinkers.
We're pretty conservative compared to the rest of Oregon.
Yeah.
And so when our vote comes out, I always look at it and go, well, that won't pass because it passed here.
Yeah.
And that's usually what happens.
Oh, yeah, it's the story of life.
Yeah.
And-
Well, hopefully you've enjoyed our free speech segment, and use your free speech, but use it wisely.
Yes, gain wisdom from others.
Especially with the comments you leave below. So.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Richard, as always.
you.
Daniel, thank you for making sure that we're on most of the time. A few screw ups today, but we'll only
I would
dock
not
your
call
pay.
them that. I'd just say that. Wait, what?
What?
Technical?
We're paying Daniel? Yeah, you didn't know that?
Garrett, you love superlatives so much. You just love the superlatives.
I absolutely, positively, 1,000,000,000% do
Yes.
not.
Daniel,
Nothing
thank you for all your
went
hard
wrong
work.
today.
Yes,
Everything
thank you,
Even though you're
Daniel.
not
showed
getting
me how
paid.
it doesn't work.
Wait, say
at
that
the
one more
wrong
time?
What?
I said nothing went wrong. It just all showed me all at once how things just don't work sometimes.
Yeah, it just
Oh.
happens.
You learned how not to do it.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, thank you, Daniel, for making us sound and look good as always. And we just hope that you guys are able to join us again, same time next week, for another robust discussion. And again, as Richard said, use your free speech, but use it with wisdom and tact. And let's hope to all create a better society for each other. So thank you so much. This is the Agora signing off. We'll see you again next week.
We done?